Dr. Scott, that's us. Look up.
Oh, I was
We're
like
here.
jamming. I was jamming to the StreamYard music.
We still haven't put together our choreography for that. Our interpretive dance
I'm
of the
doing chair
countdown.
choreography, much like, like everybody did in Flashdance.
Yes. Without the water. Got it.
Oh, I could do that. I could do the water.
Okay. I mean, or
in my case, it would just be chocolate syrup. Like,
oh my gosh. All right. Enough
of that.
Why don't you give us a proper, hi, everybody.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Behind the Couch.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I know I say it over and over again about just the absolute time dilation, time warp we've been in, but it's been a season. It's been a trimester of a lot of activity for us, a lot of change professionally, upgrades, transitional grades,
totally.
a lot of good stuff. But
I actually feel like I have decent bandwidth right now. And on that note, Scott just froze. So that's so weird. I use the term bandwidth. Hi, you're back.
No, that was just me being very
very attentive
demure and mindful as you speak. Very demure and mindful.
Right. No, I know we talked about this before, fall just zipped by. Obviously at the beginning we were in London and then the Berkshires, and I feel like, oh my gosh, okay, I got a hold on Christmas. I can do this. It doesn't feel insane, but yeah, still weird to think 2020 is feels like it's tomorrow.
Yeah. Let's Hi,
see.
Catherine. Good to see you.
There she is in the chat. Hey, everyone. So before we bring our wonderful guests on, we are going to, of course, tell you all who our new Patreon members are. I will also say I apologize. I think I'm a month behind in getting some swag out to our doctoral level folks, but I have everything here, literally on this desk to package up. I just don't want to now be in the Christmas rush at the post office. I still have our last guest that we have to send something out to as well. So I promise you guys, I will get on that. With the associate level, we have two new Patreon members. We have Amara and we have Nick W. Thank you guys so much. And then for the doctoral level, we have three new Patreon members. We have Trish, we have Amanda F, and we have Teresa. So thank you guys in the last month for supporting the show. And, we will, at the top of 2025, let you guys know what's new, what changes are going to be made, what we want to continue to bring for Patreon members. So it continues to be special for you guys and get a little bit more for your money, because we appreciate you guys so much.
We really
I don't
do.
know. Yeah. Maybe one day Scott and I will be just totally tired of doing things publicly and we'll just shut it down to Patreon only. Just have our people when we want to become hermits and get off the World Wide Web.
We'll see. Well, there's going to be a lot of opportunities coming up in the next year, I think, for our show, and we'll see how that plays out. Anyway, we would love to introduce all of you out there who are immediately with us and with us in the future, the founders of Rebel Tours out of London. First, we have Charlie. Charlie grew up in New Zealand, where she studied politics and drama at the University of Auckland before working in business development in the entertainment industry. She moved to London in 2007 and has been passionately tour guiding in both London and Oxford since 2011. She grew a little disenchanted with telling the same versions of events on the more typical tours of London, which led her to complementing her tour portfolio with women's history tours for Women of London in 2018, and eventually partnering with Ellie to create Rebel Tours. Fantastic idea.
Yes. Hi, Charlie. Let me get to Ellie. We want to talk about Ellie's background as well. Ellie grew up in the south of Spain, where she began studying her art history degree before moving to London in 2013. It was in London that she first began guiding and discovered it was a great way to share the stories that she loved with anyone that would listen to her. So, and I was one of she eventually started to find the tour industry a little soulless. And I think we're going to empathize a lot together today on that. And she longed to show people in the real London, along with the incredible mix of characters that make up its history, which led her to create Rebel Tours along with her friend and colleague, Charlie. Welcome and happy birthday, Ellie.
Thank you very much.
Of course, yes. Thanks for spending your birthday evening with us.
Great way to spend a birthday.
Oh, that is so sweet. We are very happy that you agreed to do this. You're probably like, what the heck is this crazy person on my tour talking about?
I've got my cakes waiting. It's
nice.
no
Okay. Well, so when Scott and I were there for CrimeCon UK, this was my third time in London. Every time I went, I was really wanting to do a Jack the Ripper tour, but also feeling gross about it. But wished I had done one when I left. And so when we were there, all I did was Google ethical Jack the Ripper tour, and you guys popped up. And Ellie, as you know, I took my husband and my daughter, who is 12, and it was absolutely appropriate. My husband, who's a retired cop who doesn't care anything about true crime, was like, that was fantastic. Actually, I'm dragging him along to these things. And, we'll talk more about the tour in a little bit, but obviously a reason why I thought you guys would gel so well with what we love to talk about and our audiences are really interested in now, in terms of just how can we do better if we're going to be talking about these things, whether it's historical or for us, a little bit more current. So we appreciate you guys and your time.
Oh, thank you. It's also really cool to know that you got to us by just Googling ethical Jack the Ripper tours. That's very good. Yeah. I like that. Not long ago, a lady came up to me while I was standing at the start point, and she said, "Excuse me, is this the feminist Jack the Ripper tour?" I said, "Yes, yes, it is."
I think that came up as well too. Like there was something, and I'm like, I don't know if they have their SEO set to this on purpose, but it's working. Whatever's happening. So why don't we dive in? I mean, we spoke a little bit about your professional backgrounds, and Scott and Charlie, you guys can probably talk about the soulless entertainment industry forever because you guys have those backgrounds. But what made you decide to start the tour company? Take us a little bit more in depth of just how that happened for the two of you.
Do you want to go?
Yeah. So Ali and I used to work together at a more soulless tour company. We'll just leave it at that. And when COVID happened, obviously, there was no tourism really for a couple of years. Tours weren't running. And we actually decided to use that time to work on, creating something so that we could focus on the people and stories that we wanted to be talking about on tours. Because, as you've read from our bios, kind of going around Buckingham Palace, talking about, this is how the Queen has her tea, this is why the guards have the hats and all that sort of stuff. Tours typically focus on very key stories. And if you've only got, say, 2 hours to do a tour, you're going to cover the main things that people expect to hear. But it is a conscious decision what you choose to leave out. So in a broader sense, because Jack the Ripper, What About the Women is just one of our tours, we wanted to, focus generally on women's stories, working class history, social history, the people who really shaped the city. So I think when we tell people that we are a COVID company, we started the company during COVID, they think that's, really sort of brave and bold and so on.
Or mad.
Yeah, or mad. Right. But actually, that was really a good time to put things together. And to be honest, we had no idea if it was going to work or not. One of the main ideas behind Rebel Tours was to make the tours interesting for Londoners, because we didn't know when international tourism would be back. And Londoners, they don't want to hear, the things that a visitor, especially a first-time visitor to the city, necessarily wants to hear. So I think our tours we get a really good mix of locals and visitors. And it's always really interesting when people from the US or elsewhere are coming on our tours and they're choosing our tour because they're looking for something a little different, or they're looking for a different take on a narrative that's kind of been, you know, overdone or has always been done in the same way. They want to kind of, you know, sink their teeth into something a bit more.
Yeah, I think that's the key. It's the different take. You know, we're not giving new information, but all of our tours, we're just changing the perspective. Because when we used to do, you know, the sort of classic tours, by the way, there's nothing wrong if you first time visitor to London, obviously you're going to want to see these things. But we're always told, oh, careful, don't talk about this or that. You know, nobody wants to hear about colonialism. Nobody wants to hear about empire or, you know, the slave trade. And we thought, well, why not? And that's not true. People do want to hear about it. And you can't, even you go to Buckingham Palace, you can't understand Buckingham Palace even without those things, really. So that was kind of where we started, wasn't it? We started with the kind of big sites from a different perspective.
Yeah, I think for me, the first tour we launched is a tour that we have shelved as a public tour, but is still available as a private tour, which is all of your classic sightseeing with more kind of alternative stories and so on. And that's kind of, it's transformed into something else as a public tour that's now in the National Portrait Gallery, which is really exciting. But I remember when we were developing the Buckingham Palace stop, and it was about empire, imperialism, the transatlantic slave trade. And I was actually so excited about it because I remember when I would just touch on those things with the more kind of traditional companies that I was working with, I don't think I ever got a bad review, but I did get a couple of feedbacks from people who had sort of emailed the company privately and said that, you know, it was a bit uncomfortable, that, you know, they wanted to hear these nice stories about the Queen and the royal family, and the guide was guilt tripping them about slavery. And that was very extreme, I have to say, because I was so mild on it, but acknowledging that the empire was a thing. And, you know, the British Empire at its peak was the biggest empire that's ever existed. You know, it covered 25% of the landmass and has had a huge impact on peoples around the world, including Indigenous cultures and so on. And for me, being from New Zealand as well, as a Pākehā woman from New Zealand, for me, it's very, very important to not shy away from those stories. And it's not about trying to guilt trip anyone. I don't know why anyone should feel, you know, guilty about whatever. It's like, if you're feeling uncomfortable about the mere mention of something that happened, I guess the bigger question is, why are you feeling uncomfortable? Why is that unsettling? And I think with all our tours, especially Jack the Ripper, What About the Women, is that we have a lot of those discussions around the themes on the tour, the women on the tour, and so on. And we like to have a conversation and ask people, you know, why, you know, what have you heard? Why have you thought this way? And how does it sort of make you feel? Because it is very different from the more traditional Jack the Ripper tour that's out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is great feedback for you to kind of know, okay, where do we go? I'm sure it's pretty similar of just what people have heard. But I think it, you know, when Ellie was posing those questions, it didn't feel like she was trying to quiz us and then like, now let me tell you, right? It was really like, let's talk about why we've heard these versions, which was just like such a cerebral way to be on this tour. And, you know, when we're done here, Scott and I can help you diagnose that person that wrote that email, because
I can give you the diagnosis right now. They were American.
They're American.
You know, because we ourselves, you know, have our challenges there. It's reflective of, I love how you frame this. And I would go a little bit further to say, if, you know, better discussions can be had if we're willing to sit in a little bit of distress. You know, if we can go, okay, I need to sit in this place of discomfort and acknowledge that people had it worse than I have it. Like, that's all we're asking for.
Yeah.
You know, we have something here in the States. If you go to the South, especially to New Orleans, which is a wonderful, wonderful place to visit with incredible history. But if you do plantation tours, they have changed the narrative. There are docents and tour guides that say, we need to tell you what really happened here. Like, this is this is a real thing, that people's lives were really, our country was built on the back of slave labor in many ways. But thank you so much for doing that work. You've said several times about the tours. What can you give us, like, kind of a rundown of all or several of the different tours that you offer?
So as Charlie said, that first, like, more political tour, let's say, that we do it inside the National Portrait Gallery now, which works really well because you have so many people in there, obviously, that it's kind of more concentrated, so you can include, like, a lot of really amazing stories. So we look at the radical history of Britain, let's say, or history through its more rebellious characters. So there'll be stories in there that you've never heard before, people that are not usually make it to the front pages of the history books, let's say. Or even if you have, maybe from a slightly different perspective. Because for us, I think we like to look at social movements because they show the power of the people. And that's what we're interested in. Often very ordinary people, seemingly, but doing very extraordinary things. So that's kind of the theme of that tour. And I think you can really see what makes Britain tick, or even London, just by looking at those stories. So yeah, we love that tour. We do a Covent Garden and Seven Dials kind of neighborhood tour, again, because they're very touristy areas, but no one really knows, what am I doing here? Like, why have I come to Covent Garden? I've come here to, I don't know, look at the shops, or no one really knows anything about it. London is included. So that's a nice one. And we sort of dive into quite a bit of queer history in that area, which is really lovely as well.
I think with that tour as well, people are really surprised to learn the history and the stories and the people, because that tour is called Misfits of Covent Garden. So, really talking about the kind of people of Covent Garden who maybe don't quite fit into sort of the mainstream or what have you. And I think as you're kind of going around and people are starting to get a sense of community, that's the thing, is they're starting to get a sense of, wow, people, have lived here and actually still live here. Like, there's people living all around us, because I think if you're just walking around the piazza, going to some nice shops or pubs, you really don't get that sense.
No. And then we do, we collaborate as well with museums and organizations here. So we also kind of do special things for them, or we might research an area or a topic that we like and then kind of launch it as a tour for a museum and things like that. So we're always doing different things and always looking into different things to do. Oh, well, it's Christmas, so tomorrow I'll be doing our Dickensian walk, which is super
neat.
What the Dickens?
Can you tell us a little bit about that, about what elements you include in that one?
Sure, yeah. I love it so much because I'm a big fan of A Christmas Carol. So we kind of use the narrative of A Christmas Carol, which is a really important and such a well-written story as well. I love it so much. And so we kind of look at Dickens's sort of thoughts on social class and institutions and things like that through the narrative of A Christmas Carol, but also we include some of his other works by kind of walking you through his London. So we kind of go down the same streets and alleyways that he did, explore a little bit of his life and other jobs he did before being a very famous novelist, and kind of, but used his work to sort of expose, I suppose, what he's trying to expose in A Christmas Carol, which is the failure of the system, really, in the Victorian era. But there's a lot of parallels with modern life there as well.
I remember watching a BBC adaptation just a handful of years ago of Bleak House, which I had put off reading when I was in high school. I was like, oh, I don't want to read this. And then after watching this amazing miniseries about just exposing all of the corruption in inheritance law was completely eye-opening to me. So what a wonderful idea to include that, even if not just the holiday season. I love that.
Yeah, no, I mean, occasionally we'll do it. I actually did it in October for the cast of A Christmas Carol for this theatre up in Newcastle, up in the north of England. And their director wanted them to research a little bit into the characters. So they all came along. And it was amazing actually doing that tour with Bob Cratchit, Ebenezer Scrooge.
You're like, you pay attention to this part right here.
Yeah. But it was super fun.
And you also have another Whitechapel Murders tour, right? I mean, like, do you have?
That's the
Can you
Jack
tell
the
us a
Ripper
little
one.
bit more about?
I don't like calling
Yeah.
it Jack the Ripper, and I love that they just refer to it as Whitechapel. So
We
yeah,
do actually, because the very first time we launched that tour, we actually called it what do we call it? Silent Voices of Whitechapel.
Oh.
That was the original name of the tour, because we didn't want to have Jack the Ripper in the title at all. But we found that it was a little bit slow going to get people on it.
People didn't really get what it was about at all.
Yeah. And then I had a lady on it once, kind of in the early days, and she was in marketing or whatever. And she said, I know that you don't really want to, but I think you're going to have to put Jack the Ripper in the title. So we did. And it worked. And it's very, very rare that somebody books on the tour, you know, by accident, thinking it's
right.
I think sometimes people are expecting it to be, they are still expecting there to be a mention of Jack, and we don't. I mean, the one thing we don't do on the tour is theorize on suspects or who Jack was, because, you know, this individual has been in the limelight for 130 odd years. Meanwhile, you know, the women who are central to the story have just kind of been, you know, they've become things really, and they're just kind of side characters. But, you know, it is Jack the Ripper. What about the women? So that's kind of the disclaimer really, is it's what about the women? It's not about Jack. And in a sense, for me, I feel like the whole Jack the Ripper industry, I suppose, has really profited of exploiting these women and sort of capitalizing through their stories. So I feel why should we not capitalize a bit on exploiting Jack a bit, if that makes sense? Okay, so
and it's not like nobody talks about them, you know. I always say at the beginning of the tour, it's not like you're going to go on one of those classic Jack the Ripper tours and they're not going to mention the women. It's how they talk about them that's very problematic. And I don't know if you noticed, you know, as we went by other tours, if you kind of listened in sometimes little snippets of what they were saying, and sometimes it's really horrible, and sometimes people on our tours will be quite disturbed or distressed to hear, because they've kind of been doing it differently. You know, we're like an hour in and they've been hearing about these real people and these real women that they're connecting with, and then they'll go past and hear somebody just describing these really awful, gory details.
I remember very, like, obviously one of the things that stood out to me was that you did not talk about the actual killings in like really any detail, right?
No,
I mean,
not necessary.
And at the end of our tour, which is kind of where a lot of the tours ended, right? There's other tour groups there. And I remember distinctly, we're making our way out, and one of their tour guides has their iPad and has basically a death photo, a homicide photo from back then, or a sketch or something. And I was like, yep, there you go. There's the difference.
Yeah, isn't it so weird that though? It's such a weird thing to do. You know, it's like, I always give an example, just use another serial killer. You know, I think I often say Jeffrey Dahmer or whatever, just as everybody knows. But just imagine that you were interested in one of their victims, so you Googled them and you saw like pictures of dismembered body parts, or, you know, on Wikipedia or something, or it's just such a strange thing to do.
I think Dahmer's a really good example, because so many people were very upset at Netflix for doing that series. And I personally know someone who was very vocal on social media criticizing Netflix and saying this is incredibly disrespectful to, you know, the victims and their families and so on. And the same individual, when people visit London, is someone who says, oh, you have to do a Jack the Ripper tour because they're really fun. And they're not talking about my tour, by the way. But I think what's really important is that we want to focus on how the women lived rather than how they died, and just kind of reducing their story to the last moments of their life or the last night of their life. These women they have full lives, such rich stories, and that's what we want to share. But on the photos, I do think a lot of it is with Jack the Ripper. You know, firstly, the killer has no face, which I think makes it easier for people to kind of desensitize to it. And also it's something that happened so long ago. So maybe people can't relate to it in the same way as they can to more recent crimes. But I think about it and I think it would just be, as Ali says, utterly bizarre, even if you are the biggest true crime fan, that you would think it's acceptable that you go on like a Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy tour and people start holding up photos, or in the case of one Jack the Ripper company in London, actually projecting these images onto buildings with a big projector.
No.
And bear in mind, the East End is it's a neighborhood. You've got mums walking around with young kids. I mean, don't get me started on the fact that a lot of these more traditional Jack the Ripper tours, there's loads of kids on them. You know, people seem to think it's appropriate to take young children on tours that are discussing themes that, you know, kids, I mean, they're going into graphic detail about things that we don't sort of go into. And, you know, it's just, I was asked, because I used to do, I mean, I did a feminist Jack the Ripper tour, like in the traditional sense. I felt like when I first started guiding in London, there were two tours you had to know: Westminster with Changing the Guard and Jack the Ripper. And obviously guides are freelance, so certain guides will take a more feminist approach. But on a more traditional tour, the expectation is there that you will describe those injuries in detail. And there's often an expectation of photos. And I was like, absolutely not. I'm not going to do the photos. And someone once asked me why, and I just said, you know, it's kind of like, how would you feel if a photo of your, you know, wife or girlfriend or mother or sister, if someone was showing that of her? Because I think we've just desensitized ourselves a bit to it, and it's very sad. That is a human being in any of those images.
Isn't it?
Why not show pictures of the women alive? There's quite a few of them alive, you know.
It also it sounds like it's a beast that has continued to be fed. So if we keep feeding it as this thing that is over 100 years ago, and it's in another country, and it's in the place where I'm taking a vacation, it just continually chips away at the reality of it. It chips away at the reality that we don't want to work. We don't want to look at the necessity of some women having and men having to go into sex work in order to survive, or we don't have to really look at how ugly the living situations were for people in that time. I mean, we've got our version, I think, in the modern world is being desensitized by the keyboard warriors that are safe behind their computer keyboard, right? And maybe there's something about in a group walking tour, you get to pretend that it could never happen to you, that it could never happen to anyone that you love, you know?
Yeah, this is it, because it's just in your mind, you're going, well, it's just a story. And
entertainment, right?
And it's because it doesn't even feel real, Jack the Ripper. It just feels like some sort of gothic, you know, horror story. Yeah. So I think, as you say, it is very easy to do that. It would even be weird to do if we lived in a society where, oh, thank goodness, nobody murders anyone anymore and everything's very safe. It would still be strange and disrespectful to do. But the fact is also that it still happens. All the time. You know, we're not going around talking about things that don't happen anymore. It was a very long time ago. And that's the thing. It's, you don't want people to feel bad either, because you know, I think when you've come on our tour, when we get to that point where we start talking a little bit about the photos, and people sort of like, oh, well, why would anyone do that? That's so disturbing. And I do wonder if they went on one of those Jack the Ripper tours, if they would feel the same when they got to that point, because maybe they'd just be conditioned that they're just consuming this as a story. It's just entertainment, that they'd actually be all right with it.
Yeah, I think that's the problem.
You're in a group, so you feel like it's okay, you know, but if you go in this group, you feel differently. I mean, it's just, human nature. Sorry, Charlie, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think that the issue is, you know, something that we, you know, discuss on the tour is that for a lot of Jack the Ripper tours, they've become more of an entertainment. It's a performance. And, guides are sometimes, if they're getting a good response from the group, people are having a good time, or people are shocked, or they're getting big reactions, guides are feeding off that. And I think, there are a couple of kind of false stories that are often told on Jack the Ripper tours.
on any tour.
Well, yeah, on any tour. But I mean, like, I think, for example, the prostitute's church story, which is a really classic one. And I think how that's kind of come about is, a guide, even if a guide knows they're stretching the truth, if they stretch the truth once and they get a really good response, like, oh, I'm going to use that. And I think sometimes people convince themselves that something is fact. They get confused themselves. They start telling a story, they repeat it enough times, they start to believe it.
That's a thing. It's actually a real
that's
thing.
just on a small scale, a guide saying, oh, this is where such a thing happened. But I don't know if you remember, if I told this story on our tour about the pub.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah. So, the 10 Bells pub in Spitalfields, close to Whitechapel. Yeah, it's a very famous pub in the East End. And if you go on the classic Jack the Ripper tours, well, they'll tell you all sorts. They'll say, well, Mary Jane Kelly, I went by this guy the other night. Mary Jane Kelly came and drank in here every single night. Yes. And he said, as fact. But the big one is Annie Chapman, who was murdered quite close by. So in the 70s, they kind of really exploited that fact. And they actually went so far as to change the name of the pub on this little bit of, possible information that maybe she had a drink in there.
I think it was entirely based on the fact that because she was murdered one street over, the pub is conveniently close, but there are actually closer pubs, and she may not have gone anywhere for a drink. But
no. And there's a white church right across the street, so it kind of fits nicely, right?
it fits in very nicely. It's all very theatrical. So they used to say that she had a very last drink. It sounds very dramatic. And then, of course, she haunts the pub and all the rest of it. So they changed the name to the Jack the Ripper pub. They sold souvenirs. The tour guides would go in there, sell books, sign the books and all of that.
There was the memorabilia on the walls, like a bit like a museum. It was like a mini museum, apparently.
Yeah. So, that still happens. It's not like that was a thing of the time, because there's a shop close to the start of our tour that sells mugs and t-shirts and things. You probably noticed all the puns: Jack the Clipper, the barber's Jack the Chipper, the chip shop. There's a Jack the Ripper museum in the East End, which is horrendous. All the locals detest it. So there's still all of that stuff.
Well, maybe you guys can open up a museum one day. Do it.
That would be great.
I was actually thinking about the pub the other day, but I could have the year wrong. It was definitely in the 1970s. I think it was 1976, which would have been, a year into the Yorkshire Ripper murders as well. So if you're familiar with the Yorkshire Ripper, I was just reflecting on this the other day. It's just very interesting timing to change the name of the pub at that time, really just trying to capitalize, exploiting not only women who were murdered in 1888, but women who were being murdered at the time is really quite sick. Because, the whole thing with the Yorkshire Ripper was that the police, he was given that name because the police were drawing these parallels. So there's no escaping the connection.
Yeah, that unfortunately that history kind of repeats itself as well, in terms of we've had multiple called the Night Stalker in California, and some of those things stick. What obviously I know the answer to some of these questions, but what women do you include on the tour and why? Because you definitely have more information on some than others. And maybe just if you can dispel some of the biggest myths out there, what are some of your favorites to really share with your audience?
I think also it would depend on the guide, on the night, on the crowd, because we only have 2 hours, and we mention at least 6 women. So we don't always have time to go into each and every one with great detail. So sometimes I see how it's going, or like, for example, the other night, I had a lovely couple from Sweden, and they were from very close to Gothenburg, which is close to where one of the victims is from, Elizabeth Stride. And they knew that, and they had come on the tour hoping to hear more about her. So for that particular evening, I just included more about her, and I included a bit of Swedish history in the East End, which is really fantastic. Wow. And they were very appreciative of that. So, and then it depends, because all of us, we might do the tour slightly differently. So it sort of depends. One woman that we always all include at the beginning is Martha Tabram, who's not in, what they like to call the canonical five. And the reason that we include her is because that's when the story really begins, I think, and it's where the panic really kind of starts to set into Whitechapel. And I think when you're saying about some of the biggest myths, the story that I always share is a local man called George Holland, who he used to run what was called the George's Yard Mission, very close to where Martha was staying and was murdered. And the mission, they used to offer workshops and classes to women, and the classes were taught by other women. And he gave an interview to one of the local newspapers. I think it was September 1888. So a number of murders had happened already. And he describes that the women of the mission are too frightened to come down and teach the classes. And he's sort of describing this scene of anxiety and fear. And I think a big misconception is that people are like really used to high levels of crime, and murder is sort of normalized. So you get this idea that people are just not fazed. And I really want to put across how it would be exactly the same as if it, when it happens today in our neighborhoods. People were really frightened. They were very anxious. They were very angry. Also, crime had really declined quite dramatically for a while in the Victorian era. So murder was still, as it still is, quite an extreme and obviously very rare form of crime. And it was no different in 1888. So
no, I think that's the key thing, because with Martha, sometimes people do ask us, there's a canonical five. Why do you talk about 6 women? I mean, there are a lot of modern criminologists who believe that Martha Tabram may have been the first Ripper victim. I think, as Ali says, what's important is whether she was the first victim of Jack the Ripper or whether she was the victim of another misogynistic crime. It really is her murder on the 7th of August, 1888, because it really, people need to understand that it was a shock. It wasn't the norm. And I think sometimes when you're just describing the community at the time, people living hand to mouth and poverty and crime and things like that, people just assume these are just the sorts of things that happen in bad neighborhoods. And that's not the case at all. It was
well,
harrowing.
That leads into another question we would have for you is, where are you pulling all of your research from? It's got to be, clearly you both know exactly what you're talking about. Where are you diving in? Where are you getting, or where do you feel like you get the most profound, accurate information for your production?
Accurate, it's difficult, isn't it? Because you always have to look at
you lose the things in history, right?
Yeah, so it depends what you're looking at. And I think my favorite is the notes from the public inquest. That's probably the best source of information. Luckily, we have a lot of those notes. Now, bear in mind, a lot of the notes that remain are made by journalists. So again, you have to still be a little bit careful. But because after each murder there was a public inquiry, you get all of these interviews with witnesses, with family members, the loved ones of the victims, and police officers, anyone and everyone. So it's a very rich source of information. And it's interesting because you get to see how the women are sort of viewed and spoken about from all of those different perspectives. It's not going to be the same, the police officer, as you know, the woman's boyfriend or husband. So those are very interesting. I personally really love newspapers as well. Again, you know, you've got to be aware of what newspaper it is, but I love newspapers because they give you like a real snapshot of what was going on. I even love reading like the adverts in the newspaper from
same. Love newspapers.com.
I love them. Yeah, love it. And we're very lucky in the UK and London. We have amazing local archives, really good ones here. Obviously, we've got the British Library, which is fantastic, but we have really good local archives in the East End. We've got amazing census records. We use all of those.
Because sometimes people ask, well, how do you know these things about the women's lives? And, you know, there is a lot of documents relating to all of our private lives, you know, forgetting our online, you know, what you can get online today. I mean, you know, there's births, deaths and marriages, there's school records, there's all sorts of things. But as Ali was saying, I also really find the newspapers interesting because 1888 was a really interesting year in newspaper history, in that was the year that all taxes were actually abolished on newspapers. And it's also a time in history when literacy is on the rise for the first time. So we think about the power of the press today. Really, the power of the press back in 1888 was extraordinary. Newspapers would actually go to print at different times of the day so that people could kind of keep up with the news and so on. But because the newspapers were cheap, you've got more people able to read, but you've got more people able to afford these papers. So the propaganda machine that was the newspaper really had a big impact on how people were viewing what was going on in Whitechapel. So if something's in the papers and people are absorbing this information, that's really going to shape what their thoughts are. And, you know, like the police have their own biases about, you know, these women and so on. So I think a big problem was that, you know, people outside of the community and even the people policing that community really just had a lack of understanding about the reality and you know, the lives of poor women and poor people in Whitechapel at that time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the thing that stood out to me was, you know, things that we didn't have the research or the wherewithal to even study as an issue back then, that we can now take what we know and, you know, look back in time. Just, you know, alcoholism and women, right? You know, the ways in which that impacted their family dynamics, because we're talking about women with families that either were, you know, asked to leave by families or chose to leave because they probably felt like a burden. They probably felt like they weren't good moms. And it, you know, just something, how do you wrap your head around that back then? I mean, I guess the narrative is like you just kind of default to saying that maybe they're a sex worker when majority were not the case.
Or, you know, that word that they use, fallen woman.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, when they fall into that category. And I sort of talk about in relation to alcoholism, you know, which for some of the women does unfortunately become a coping mechanism a little bit later on, but to deal with some pretty horrendous things going on in their lives. And one of the women, you know, we talk about Polly Nichols, and, you know, she had this seemingly quite horrible domestic situation going on where her husband was having an affair with the next door neighbor, and eventually she's the one that ends up leaving, which just tells you, I mean, divorce and separation is still quite taboo today. In 1888, where she's in a very precarious financial situation, and just for doing that, you know, she's labeled the fallen woman, you know, for basically failing as a woman, because, as you said, you know, you feel like you're a bad mom, so you're not a good wife and you're not a good mother, you're a fallen woman. You might as well be a prostitute, I suppose. That's what you do. And that's where the assumption then,
even if there's no evidence.
Right.
But, you know, the alcoholism thing, I think what's really important to note as well is that, yes, that is a theme, that's a very real thing that needs, these discussions need to be had around these women and their realities. But it wasn't just a coping mechanism for the women, it was for the men as well. But the thing is that no one talks about the fact that a lot of the men in Whitechapel were drunk as well.
Yeah.
Because men being drunk is totally normalized.
Sure.
You know? Whereas women being drunk, oh my God,
in public,
this is outrageous. You know, you think about Kate Eddowes and, you know, causing a scene in the street,
being arrested.
Yeah,
you know?
and I mean, if a bloke had been doing what she was doing, there's no way he would have been arrested. It just wouldn't have happened. So.
And you don't see reporting on, you know, murder against men, all these comments made on, you know, their drinking habits, which is to the point of obsession when you read some of these reports on the women. But even today, you know, why do we need to know that? When you read,
we're not so far removed from that still. I mean, when we interrogate a rape victim and say, well, what were you wearing? You know, that it's that attitude as well.
Exactly. We had there's a very sad story. Was it last year? Nicola, the lady who went missing in Lancashire.
Lancashire.
Yeah. And it was a missing persons case. It was a lady. Unfortunately, it was an accident and she'd fallen into the canal.
Into the canal,
Really sad story. But she was missing for a little while.
Yeah.
I wish I could remember her surname now. But yeah, she was missing for a good while. And of course, everybody was speculating on what's happened. And the newspaper, I can't remember which newspaper it was, brought out this story about the fact that a few years ago she had a drinking problem and she was going through the menopause.
Yeah.
And it was, what is that? And I just read that and I thought, what are they trying to do? Like paint us this picture of this
hysterical woman
running around drinking. I
obviously
thought,
her uterus has made her crazy, right?
Exactly.
It's just wandering around all over.
Yeah, I could not believe it. And that evening I had a Whitechapel tour and I talked about it on the tour that evening because I just couldn't believe it. And I thought, how is it that in 2023 it was that I have to bring a story that's just happened to a story about 1888 and draw this exactly the same parallel? It's quite ridiculous.
Ellie's like, let me get my soapbox out. I have a captive audience. We're all gonna get in this together. That's good.
Yeah. Which is actually the beauty, of doing this, that you can do that, right? You have an immediate audience, which is why I like doing tours. I like writing as well, but I like the immediacy, I think, of learning a new information and being like, right, I can't wait.
I think that's the great thing about our tours is because we're focusing on social history, public history, we're able to pull in current events very easily.
Yeah.
Which I think, again, it makes it a lot easier for people to relate to the information you're giving to them. Even if, someone's coming on the tour, they have no experience of what it would be like to be in Whitechapel in 1888. There may be something else in those stories that they can connect with.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, the way we kind of framed this talk today was looking at, and I know this is one of several tours, and obviously we've touched on that, but looking at this as almost, ethical crime tourism in a sense. I'm very curious, what you guys think about just kind of true crime in general, the behemoth of an industry that it's become. And like, are you guys consumers? I mean, is it more of just a history interest for you, or do you sit down and indulge in some of these things too?
Look, yeah, but not like I used to.
No.
So my interest in the Whitechapel murders was, the same as a lot of people from what I hear. And it was quite, a bit macabre because I liked that when I was a teenager. And I remember my nan bought me this massive book. I still have it, which is just called The Case Files or something, isn't it? It's like a huge book that has all the information in. And it's a bit of a strange gift to give to your granddaughter, but she's a bit of a strange lady herself. So she gave me that book, and I love her.
I love her.
No, she's great. She's a bit macabre, isn't she?
Yeah, she's very macabre.
Yeah, she loves all that. So maybe that's why, because she loves that. So I got this book, and that kind of began an interest into it. It was only really, I think, when we started thinking about doing this tour, that this kind of idea about ethical true crime kind of, it started to form. Because I did used to love to watch all the documentaries and the podcasts, but now I do definitely curate it a lot more. For sure. Which is why I don't want people to feel, really bad if they are typical consumers, because I was as well. That's how I got into it, and that's how I started thinking about, actually, is this all right? The way these things I'm listening to, the way that people are speaking about this, I don't think it's. So that's when I started to question these things. I don't know if it's the same for you.
Yeah, it's similar. I mean, I was actually going to go to CrimeCon this year, and one of the reasons I didn't go was I felt a bit weird about going, because I'd heard about what CrimeCon in the US is like. And there were a couple of podcasts that, I listened to and coming over to the UK and was saying how great CrimeCon UK was and everything. And then I heard that you were there as well. And I thought, missed an opportunity here. But I think it is about what you consume, because I don't think I've ever listened to any trashy true crime podcasts. I've been quite sort of particular about, what I consume. I mean, one of the podcasts that I really like is Laura Richards' Crime Analyst podcast. I just have so much respect for her work. And, from that, I think, I discover a lot of podcasters through other podcasts mentioning people, giving shout outs and so on. And you get some really good stuff there. But I think it's all about how the material is treated. One of the things we say on our tour is that there's nothing wrong with being interested in true crime. It's when we desensitize ourselves from it.
I love that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a human nature to it. I mean, obviously it wouldn't be such a big industry if we didn't have that natural curiosity. I know when I like to go different places, there is something about visiting where something very profound and oftentimes tragic happened that just puts it into context for you to say, or the steps where this happened or what have you. It makes it more real, which I think we sometimes need to make it more real, because we are
because it's such an important story, really. Because when we first started discussing the idea, obviously we already had the other tours running, and we thought, is it the right thing to do this kind of tour? And then we thought, well, it's a very important story to tell, and we need to be out there telling it properly, I think was our idea. And we're not the first to do that. Hallie Rubenhold has a fantastic book, The Five, and she's on a podcast as well, Bad Women, which we love.
It's a great podcast.
And it's such a great book. I always recommend it to everyone after the tour as a bit of recommended reading as well, because it's so accessible. It's very easy to read. It's very engaging. So I think she's really cool, and it's important because it's still happening. This is the thing, I don't know what the stats are like in the US, but in the UK, the last time they sort of took this data, I think was in 2021, and there were over 140 women murdered that year by men that we know of. That's unacceptable. So we need to tell the stories. We need to keep telling the stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can all evolve. I mean, Dr. Scott and I have, felt that when we started this over 7 years ago, we were very clinical, and that can come off as a little robotic and with and that's, because of where we were starting off, and we were terrified of how to come across, but also through our lens and working with criminals and being forensic psychologists.
Did you not want to come across too fun? Did you?
Yeah. I mean, we wanted our friendship to certainly shine through, and we wanted something more casual than our day jobs, right? Because we do have to be buttoned up there quite a bit, and so it was this weird of in between of finding sort of who we were, but yeah, we have certainly evolved to where we have taken more careful consideration, and especially as getting to know people in the true crime community, including family members and victims and survivors. I can tell you, CrimeCon UK is much different than CrimeCon US, and I think you'd be
Completely
pleasantly
different. Not even the same
surprised.
company.
Yeah, they just use
Oh,
the same
wow.
name.
Okay.
It's actually different producers. They just share
Wow.
a name, but you know, from our first time, the tone at the beginning is incredibly ethical. This is about putting victims first. And I was telling Scott, this year it almost felt like a professional conference. You know, you're going and you're hearing from people in the field with expertise. And then the, you know, like entertainment piece almost feels like a side to that, which was really nice. So I think you guys would, you know, fit in very, very well.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
we'll
better
go
go
next
next
year.
year.
Yeah, there was an evolution for us as well, that I think we wanted to be careful, and we have to be because of our jobs and our connection to large agencies, we had to be very careful, but it really hits home when you're at one of these smaller conferences and then you're sitting next to a family member, you're sitting next to a survivor, and it becomes a different thing then. And Shiloh and I also got to take part in a little bit of a sort of a filming of a get together where there was a survivor of a family member who was a victim of Dahmer's, and that was astounding to me because it's been so long since, I mean, those killings took place a long time ago, relatively real, but the idea that here's a survivor and there is somebody that is still impacted by media or entertainment's decision to, you know, change this into something else. So yeah, it's interesting how your perspective changes when it becomes more real to you.
That's I kind of that's really really tough, because we're not really in situations like that, because in terms of speaking to victims and things, at least not what people will share with you on a tour, and I guess if you've had those things happen to you, you're probably not going to go on a tour, but yeah, sometimes we talk about the things that have happened to the women. You can tell people sometimes people do get upset, because we're talking about things like suicide, alcoholism, obviously addiction, things like that, and obviously these things affect people all the time. And you sort of sometimes you can feel it, can't you? When people start getting upset by some of the themes. But again, as you were saying, it's hard to strike that balance, because I hope it hasn't come across that our tours are very serious and depressing as well.
No,
there is laughter.
Yeah, of course.
Just not highly
inappropriate bits. Yeah,
but there's laughter. People do have a good time. Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time, especially on your special day. I hope that you're gonna, like, maybe is the cake the pre-game and you're gonna go out and party a little bit tonight.
Do you know what?
She's like, her face.
I've got work in the morning.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, we have
a double. But if anyone is watching from London, we got some space in the afternoon, don't we? If they want to come and do what the decades.
Yeah, I am going to have a nice glass of wine or two.
Yeah.
So,
excellent.
But I've done my sort of going out bit the other day. So I thought,
okay.
Right,
well, if we make it back for a conference in the next couple of years, we're definitely going to have to take you both for birthday drinks. But here at the end, we like to kind of shake it up a little bit and ask a couple of rapid fire questions just to have nothing to do with what we produce. So what is your favorite traditional British snack? And if you've been exposed to it, what's your favorite American snack?
Favorite British snack? Oh gosh,
I think I'm going to go sausage roll.
Sausage roll, is it?
Yeah.
I had a sausage roll today.
Yeah.
Vegan sausage roll.
Yeah. So we're both vegan. We also do a vegan food tour. We forgot to mention that.
So I'm going to say vegan sausage roll. And American snack. Now the thing is, I don't have a big sweet tooth. I know you guys you love sweet.
We love our sugar.
Oh, Oreos.
I like Oreos.
Oreos.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oreos.
So no Jaffa
Oreos.
cakes for you, no ginger creams, no.
No, you could get the ginger nuts. Are they called ginger nuts? I keep
Ginger
thinking New
nuts.
Zealand.
Yeah.
Ginger
They are
nut. You
called
call them
nuts.
ginger snaps,
that
but you call
sounds
them ginger
really.
nuts.
So it's like a cookie. It's just a flat circular cookie. So I don't
Yeah.
know if that's the same. It is okay. Because then
Yeah,
we've
we
got
call them
brandy
ginger
snaps.
snaps. You call
Ginger
them
snaps.
ginger nuts.
I like
Okay.
those. Yeah.
Yeah.
I am always down for a good food tour when I go anywhere that I'm
Oh, yeah.
unfamiliar with.
Yeah.
It is the best way to see a new city and
Absolutely. Yeah.
get introduced to food. Okay, one more. What's your go-to karaoke song, even if you wouldn't sing it publicly?
Oh my god. Yeah.
So I usually go for I like Teenage Dirtbag.
Oh really?
Love it.
And I
love it.
And I'm
Love
always
it.
told that that's my karaoke song.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Got it,
I always
got
go for
it.
that one. Because that one gets the crowd.
Yeah.
Well, a certain crowd,
True.
a certain
True.
age crowd gets them going now. So I
Yeah.
go for that one. I think.
I think for me, it's anything from the 80s. I'd
Ah.
love to say Edge of 17, but I ain't ever going to be able to sing that.
But that's a good one. But
Yeah.
that's a very hard one.
That's
yeah.
challenging.
Yeah.
Sing in the shower, that one.
Yeah, I think
Awesome.
anything 80s is a good karaoke song. Yeah.
I think we curated a tour for when we go back. It has to involve
Yeah.
food and snacks and karaoke.
Perfect.
That's
Yeah.
good.
You guys, thank you so much for your time. I've been dropping your link in the chat for folks. I will also make sure that it's linked to the final YouTube page, just so when people come back and look at this, they can check you guys out. I would love to come back. I mean, you could do the same tour with these ladies and it would be different every time. But I would certainly, the one in the National Portrait Gallery sounds fantastic. So, but yeah, thanks so much for your time. This was really cool. We appreciate you agreeing to this.
No, thank you guys. It's
thank
been really
you.
fun. Thank you very
It
much.
was great meeting you.
Yeah,
You
have a great day.
too. All right. Happy birthday, Ellie. And please take
Thank
care,
you.
Charlie. Everyone else, have a good Saturday. Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
All right.